This is the image they did not want you to focus on today. While the world is tracking Iranian missile strikes, body counts in the Gulf, and the price of oil spiking past $120 a barrel, two men had a phone call yesterday afternoon, March 8, 2026, that will shape North America's economic architecture for the next decade. One of them is managing the most significant military operation America has launched since Iraq. The other one is watching his country get carved out of a trade agreement it helped build. The Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, and the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, held a conversation on a range of issues, including the economy, developments in the Middle East, and trade relations between the two countries. Prime Minister of Canada, that is the official readout. 11 words for a conversation that carries the weight of $1.3 trillion in annual bilateral trade? A war metastasizing across the Middle East, and a trade pact that is now being renegotiated without Canada in the room. Buckle up, because what just happened is bigger than it looks, and nobody on cable news is connecting all the dots. Let us start with the Middle East, because that is the backdrop against which this phone call took place, and if you do not understand the backdrop, you will not understand the stakes. On February 28, 2026, Trump announced major combat operations against Iran, with massive joint U.S.-Israel strikes targeting military and government sites. Iranian state television confirmed that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was among those killed by airstrikes in Tehran on the first day of the strikes. ABC-7, that is not a regional skirmish. That is a decapitation strike against the most consequential theocracy in the Middle East. The supreme leader of Iran, dead. The IRGC command structure shattered. On March 8, 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei was elected to replace his father as supreme leader, and the IRGC, as well as Iran's top leaders, pledged their allegiance to him. Wikipedia Trump called the new supreme leader a lightweight and threatened he would not last long without American approval. That number should terrify you more than any headline. Within 8 days of the death of Khamenei, a new supreme leader is already in place, and the war has not stopped. Now here is what that means for Canada, and here is the connection nobody is making. Canada has roughly 75% of its total exports flowing south into the United States. On that number, 75%, is not an abstraction. It is the oxygen supply of the Canadian economy. Carney has set a goal for Canada to double its non-US exports in the next decade. PBSA-worthy ambition. But right now, today, in March of 2026, the United States is the buyer of last resort for Canadian aluminum, steel, lumber, energy, and agricultural products. When that relationship fractures, the fracture is not theoretical. It is plant closures. It is layoffs. It is towns that do not come back. The Middle East war has added a dimension to this phone call that nobody in the Ottawa press gallery is fully pricing in. The United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, China, and Poland urged citizens to leave Iran and the Gulf states due to safety risks, as the war could last from 4 to 5 weeks or even more. Wikipedia oil prices are responding accordingly. Canada is an energy producer. Higher oil prices benefit Canadian producers, but Canada also needs American market access to move that energy, and that access is now a bargaining chip. Trump understands this. He is operating this negotiation on multiple fronts simultaneously. Military in the Gulf, economic with Beijing, and trade pressure against Ottawa. This is not incompetence. Whatever you think of the strategy, it is coordinated leverage. Now let us talk about what was actually on the table during that phone call yesterday, because the public readout gives you the menu without telling you what was ordered. On March 5th, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Mexican Secretary of Economy Marcelo Ebrard announced the first round of bilateral discussions in preparation for the joint review of the USMCA. The ministers instructed negotiators to begin a scoping discussion on the necessary measures to ensure the benefits of the agreement accrue primarily to the parties, including by reducing dependence on imports from outside the region, strengthening rules of origin, and enhancing the security of North American supply chains. United States Trade Representative read that again carefully. The United States and Mexico, bilateral. The first round of USMCA negotiations was launched 3 days before the Carney-Trump phone call. And Canada was not in the room. That is not an accident. That is a signal. Here is what the administration has been calculating for months. The USMCA review is scheduled for July 2026. U.S. Trade Representative Greer told both the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee that he was not prepared to recommend renewal of the USMCA to the president without changes. Brookings, not renewal without changes. and the preliminary negotiating dance is happening bilaterally with Mexico while Canada watches from the corridor. This is the same playbook Trump ran in 2017 with NAFTA. Open bilateral channels with Mexico first, use the bilateral momentum to isolate Canada, and then bring Canada to the table from a position of weakness. The math is merciless, and Carney knows it. This is the context in which yesterday's phone call has to be understood. Carney is not calling Trump from a position of strength. He is receiving a call from a president who is managing an active war, who has just launched bilateral trade negotiations with Mexico without Canada, who threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian exports if Ottawa signed a comprehensive trade deal with China, and who called USMCA irrelevant at a Ford plant in Dearborn last month. The word irrelevant, that is not negotiating bluster. That is a man who genuinely believes he holds all the cards. Here is what Carney has done right. Give him credit where it is due, because this analysis has to be honest about both sides of the ledger. Carney told reporters that Trump called him and that they spoke for a half hour. I explained to him our arrangement with China. I explained to him what we're doing. 12 new deals, 4 continents. In 6 months, Carney said. He was impressed. CBC News 12 deals, 4 continents, in 6 months. That is not the record of a leader who is passive in the face of American pressure. Carney has emerged as a spokesman for a movement to link up countries and counter the U.S. under Trump. The Prime Minister plans to travel to India, Australia, and other countries in an effort to diversify trade away from dependence on the U.S. PBS. The strategy is sound. The instinct that Canada cannot remain 75% dependent on a single buyer who has demonstrated willingness to weaponize that dependency is strategically correct. No serious economist would argue otherwise. But, and this is a significant but, the Carney Liberals need to rebuild trust with the Trump administration, negotiate a trade deal similar to those among the UK, Europe, Asia, and India, and eliminate trade uncertainty that is costing billions in lost investment. If the USMCA is not successfully renegotiated, the country's prosperity could be at risk, leading to increased deficit spending and higher taxes to support a bloated welfare state. Independent Institute, that is the fiscal reality sitting underneath Carney's global tour. GDP growth remains sluggish, with youth unemployment at 14.7%. Food bank usage has reached record levels, with nearly 2.2 million visits recorded in March 2025, one-third of which involving children. Independent Institute. Those numbers are the receipts, and they do not lie. Canada can build 12 trade deals on 4 continents. But if the USMCA implodes in July, those 12 deals will not absorb the shock in time. The diversification strategy is a 5 to 10-year project. So the USMCA review is a 5-month deadline. Let us put a real number on what a USMCA collapse means for ordinary Canadians, because this conversation deserves the precision it is not getting from mainstream coverage. The hit to the level of GDP could be 5% from long-lasting tariffs of 25% and 10% on energy. CIBC 5% of GDP. That is not a slowdown. That is a structural wound. Deloitte expects the Canadian economy to grow by just 1.5% in 2026. The review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement in July 2026 will be a pivotal event. The ability of Canadian exports to go to the U.S. tariff-free if they are compliant with the current agreement has been key in keeping Canada's economy from faltering. Changes to the agreement that restrict or eliminate this access to the U.S. will have dire consequences. Global news, dire consequences. That is a senior economist at Deloitte using language that central bankers do not use unless they mean it. The Bank of Canada has already confirmed the damage in motion. There have been layoffs in industries affected by tariffs, and employment has fallen in trade-sensitive sectors. Bank of Canada, not projected layoffs, not modeled scenarios, actual layoffs already happening. The steel sector, the aluminum sector, the forestry sector. These are not abstractions. These are communities in Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia where the mill is the town, and the mill is watching July 2026 the way a cardiac patient watches their monitor. British Columbia alone could see a cumulative loss of $69 billion in economic activity between 2025 and 2028. Job losses are estimated at 124,000 by 2028, with the largest declines in natural resource sector, export industries, and associated manufacturing. Government of British Columbia, 124,000 jobs in one province. That is not a rounding error. That is a generation of lost economic momentum in a province that is already strained by housing costs and demographic pressure. Now let us talk about the Middle East dimension of this call specifically, because this is where the geopolitical and economic threads converge in ways that are genuinely consequential for Canada. Behind the scenes, Trump saw Netanyahu as a close partner and was genuinely open to his counsel on Iran. One side of the House was negotiating and the other side of the House was doing joint military planning with Israel, a U.S. official said. He was assessing both things all the time. Axios, the United States, is now managing an active military campaign while simultaneously running parallel tracks of economic coercion against allies and competitors alike. Canada is an ally. That has not protected it. Britain's Prime Minister Starmer and Trump discussed the latest situation in the Middle East and the military cooperation between the UK and US through the use of RAF bases in support of the collective self-defense of partners in the region. Gov.uk, that was also March 8th, same day as the Carney call. 2 allies, 2 phone calls, 2 different conversations. Britain is discussing military cooperation and base access. Canada is discussing trade and the economy. That gap tells you everything about where these 2 relationships currently sit. Canada is not a military partner in the Iran operation. Canada's NATO spending commitments have been a persistent irritant in the bilateral relationship, and the Trump administration has made it explicitly clear that security and trade are linked. The Trump administration has made it clear to Canada that access to the U.S. market will depend on the northern neighbor addressing U.S. trade and non-trade concerns. This includes action on the border against illegal migration and the flow of fentanyl and money laundering. But perhaps just as important, it requires shouldering more of the burden for continental defense and an increased commitment to NATO. Center for Strategic and International Studies, that is the actual price list. It is not just about softwood, lumber, and dairy supply management. It is about defense spending, missile systems, and Arctic security. And right now, while the United States fights a war in the Persian Gulf, Canada's contribution to Western military architecture is under a microscope. Here is what Carney has on the table going into this phase of the relationship. Carney is attempting to negotiate a reduction or elimination of the various tariffs by simultaneously addressing security and defense irritants ahead of any renegotiation of the USMCA. He has directed Canada's Department of National Defense to engage in discussions on Trump's Golden Dome missile defense plan. Consistent with this, on July 16, 2025, Canada's Minister of National Defense removed all restrictions on Canada's air and missile defense. Center for Strategic and International Studies, that is a meaningful concession. Military cooperation is real currency with this White House. And Carney has been spending it carefully. The Middle East being on the agenda in yesterday's call is not incidental. When an ally is at war, the question of what you contribute, or conspicuously fail to contribute, is live at every bilateral conversation. Now here is where the advantage and disadvantage calculus becomes genuinely uncomfortable to lay out honestly. The advantage for Canada in this moment, the war, not in a cynical sense, but in a structural sense. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and 500 business and agricultural groups have backed the USMCA, along with a bipartisan group of members of Congress. The American prospect American manufacturers, automotive, aerospace, steel, need Canadian aluminum and components. They need cross-border supply chains that have been integrated for 30 years. The Iran war is driving up energy costs for American consumers. Inflation is already a vulnerability for the administration. Blowing up the USMCA in the middle of a war-driven inflation spike would be politically catastrophic. Inflation in the U.S. is ticking up. The submissions to USTR overwhelmingly show that American manufacturers are desperate to keep the USMCA in place because they can't build cars or houses without Canadian aluminum, steel, and lumber. The American prospect, the clock is not entirely Trump's to manage. The disadvantage, Mexico moved first. The bilateral arrangement is not a new development. Last October, both Mexican and U.S. officials said they expected much of the negotiations during the 2026 review of the Trilateral Pact to be bilateral. Mexico News Daily Canada has known this was coming. The question is whether Carney's team spent those months building a counter-strategy or watching the drift with diplomatic anxiety. The evidence is mixed. Carney went to Mexico to shore up the trilateral alliance. Carney quickly reached out to President Claudia Sheinbaum, inviting her to the G7 summit he hosted in Kananaskis, and later made an official visit to Mexico to deepen ties. This is more sustained outreach than any Canadian Prime Minister has attempted in decades, arguably since Brian Mulroney. America's Quarterly, that is the right play. But Mexico and the United States have now begun formal bilateral scoping discussions for the USMCA review, starting the week of March 16th. Canada is still waiting for its invitation to that table, and then there is the secondary front, the information war, after their January phone call, and the two sides offered directly contradictory accounts of what was said. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he was in the Oval Office when Trump spoke with Carney, and that the Prime Minister was very aggressively walking back his Davos speech. CBC News Carney's response was immediate and unambiguous. To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the President, I meant what I said in Davos, Carney told reporters. Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. CNBC 2 versions, one call, no joint readout. This is not a minor communication breakdown. This is a structural feature of diplomacy with this White House. The administration uses information asymmetry as a negotiating weapon. They did it with Ukraine, they did it with Canada in January, they are doing it now. The fact that the March 8th readout from the Canadian Prime Minister's office is 11 words long is itself a statement. They agreed to remain in close contact. Prime Minister of Canada, that is the entire substantive content of the public record, 11 words, for a conversation covering a war in the Middle East, USMCA negotiations, and the bilateral economic relationship between two countries that together represent approximately $2 trillion in annual economic activity. The brevity is not innocence. The brevity is protection. Carney learned from January, you do not give the White House the material to spin. Here is the hidden connection that cable news is not drawing. Trump rescinded Canada's invitation to join his Board of Peace and threatened to levy 100% tariffs on Canada unless the Carney government backed down from a new agreement for a Canadian trade deal with China. Wikipedia, that threat was made in January. Now in March, Trump is running an active military operation in the Middle East. The oil markets are volatile, the Gulf states are nervous, China is watching, and Carney is on the phone with Trump discussing what exactly. The readout says economy and trade, but in this moment, economy and trade includes the energy market implications of the Iran war, includes China's position as Canada's second-largest trade relationship, includes whether Canada's Arctic security posture will translate into tangible trade concessions. These threads are not separate, they are one thread. On March 6th, the United Nations declared that the U.S.-Israel war on Iran had evolved into a major humanitarian emergency due to the affected regions currently hosting nearly 25 million people as refugees. Wikipedia, 25 million. Canada has historically been one of the world's most active refugee resettlement countries. That is both a humanitarian imperative and a political flashpoint inside Canada, where immigration has been a dominant domestic issue for 3 consecutive election cycles. Trump knows this. The pressure on Carney is not just external, there are fractures in his own coalition. Progressive voters who want more humanitarian response, economic nationalists who want tighter borders, resource sector workers who want tariff relief yesterday. A minority government navigating all of that while fielding calls from the most unpredictable American president in modern history. And the domestic economic picture underneath that political pressure is not forgiving. Export volumes remain weak, pulled down particularly by tariff-hit sectors like metal and forestry products. Consumption spending, which accounts for about 60% of GDP, looks vulnerable amid weak population growth, a challenging labor market, and record-high debt. The burden of debt servicing already absorbs more than 14% of household disposable incomes, Farm Credit Canada. 14% of household income going to debt service. Before tariffs, before a USMCA renegotiation that could strip out the exemptions keeping most Canadian goods duty-free into the American market, the ordinary Canadian family is not watching this phone call with academic detachment. They are watching it with a mortgage renewal coming up and a job in a sector that exports to the United States. The Bank of Canada has been unsparing in its own assessment. U.S. tariffs are anticipated to permanently reduce the level of Canadian GDP compared with January projections. The level of GDP is projected to be about 1.5% lower by the end of 2026. The structural adjustment and the weakness in demand are expected to lead to a period of slow growth in household incomes, which will weigh on household spending particularly in 2026. Bank of Canada permanently. The Bank of Canada used the word permanently, not cyclically, not temporarily. The trade war has placed the Canadian economy on a lower structural path, and that is before July. That is, before the USMCA review produces an outcome that could either stabilize that path or accelerate the descent. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs, export bans, and restrictions on skilled workers. It did not work. Capital found a way. The economic gravity between integrated neighbors does not reverse on political command. Both the US and Canada understand this at some level. The question is whether that shared understanding survives the negotiating theater long enough to produce a deal that both sides can live with. The math is merciless, and both leaders are doing the calculation. This phone call happened in the middle of a war. That is not incidental. That is the condition. The Middle East is burning. Iran is responding to the US-Israel operation with missile and drone attacks targeting Israel, regional US bases, and multiple Gulf nations. Wikipedia. The energy market has not stabilized. The humanitarian situation is deteriorating, and the geopolitical ripple from a destabilized Iran extends into the oil pricing that directly affects the economic negotiating balance between Canada and the United States. Canada benefits as an energy producer when Gulf supply contracts. But a prolonged war creates the kind of macro uncertainty that freezes investment, suppresses business confidence, and makes every bilateral trade negotiation more volatile and less rational. What happens to the labor market next will depend critically on what happens with the Canada-US trade relationship. Bank of Canada, that is the Bank of Canada. Not a political commentator, not a partisan analyst, issuing a direct warning about the dependence of Canadian employment on the outcome of a diplomatic relationship that is right now being shaped by phone calls with 11-word readouts. The workers at the Algoma steel plant, the forestry workers in British Columbia, the auto sector employees in southwestern Ontario, none of them are in that room. None of them are on that call, but all of them are the stakes. Now let us talk about what September looks like if this goes wrong. The USMCA review concludes in July 2026. If one country chooses to withdraw from the USMCA following a minimum of 6 months' notice, this will affect the others. Brookings, if the United States announces in July that it is moving to bilateral arrangements with Mexico and Canada separately, the Canadian economy faces a period of profound uncertainty during active military conflict in the Middle East. With oil markets already disrupted, with inflation already elevated in North America, and with Canadian manufacturers dependent on integrated supply chains that do not have an overnight substitute. That is not a scenario. That is a sequence of events that is currently in motion. 3 things to watch in the days and weeks ahead. Watch the week of March 16th. That is when the first formal round of US-Mexico bilateral USMCA scoping discussions begins. And whether Canada is formally invited to parallel discussions or sits outside the room will tell you more about Carney's actual leverage than any phone call readout ever will. If Canada is still absent from formal trilateral discussions by the end of March, read that as confirmation that Washington has already decided on the bilateral path and is managing Canada's expectations rather than its interests. Watch Canada's defense spending announcement. The Golden Dome missile defense discussions are live. Whether Carney can convert defense cooperation into tariff relief is the central question of his economic diplomacy right now. If he announces a meaningful increase in NATO-aligned defense spending in the next 30 days, it will be currency in the bilateral relationships, the kind of tangible commitment this White House responds to. If he does not, the White House will use that absence as leverage. Security and trade are not separate files in this administration. They are the same file. Watch the oil markets and the war timeline. The Iran conflict is still active. If this conflict escalates further, if the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested, if Gulf state infrastructure takes additional damage, the energy price shock will ripple through the North American economy with force. Canada benefits as a producer, but the political instability that comes with a prolonged Middle East war creates unpredictable pressure on every bilateral relationship the United States is currently managing. Trump is not a linear processor of competing crises. He operates through dominance and reaction. Canada needs to be precise and patient inside that dynamic. One wrong move, one public statement, one unauthorized trade deal announcement, one leaked diplomatic frustration, and the relationship resets at a lower temperature. This is not a story about 2 politicians on a phone call. This is a story about the architecture of North American power being renegotiated in real time, against the backdrop of a war nobody fully anticipated. with an economic foundation underneath that is more fragile than the official projections suggest and more consequential than the brevity of any readout can convey. A former central banker, who once steered the Bank of England through a financial crisis, is on the phone with a former real estate developer who is now commanding joint military operations in the Persian Gulf, while simultaneously trying to dissolve the trade architecture of the continent he dominates. Neither of them has a map for exactly what comes next. The geography of North American power is being redrawn in real time. Capital does not wait for diplomatic niceties. The aluminum smelters, the auto plants, the lumber mills, the 124,000 jobs in British Columbia alone, they are watching July 2026, the way a surgeon watches a vital sign monitor. One number goes wrong and the intervention changes completely. Subscribe, stay tuned. The next move in this sequence comes the week of March 16th, and when it does, you will want to understand everything that was set up in a phone call that lasted an afternoon and produced 11 words of official record. History is moving fast. Make sure you are watching.